My mother had a sister who was very well dressed. The sister lived in San Francisco, and she worked and bought clothes all the time. So I was the best dressed girl in Maine, I guess, because she would send me all her clothes, and mother would alter them if necessary. Even underwear, satin slips with lace and all kinds of beautiful things like that. And I just felt very lucky to have so many clothes. Women didn't wear pants in those days. My mother would just hike her skirts up and tuck them into a pair of boots or whatever she wanted to wear on her feet when we would go on these walks. And as I remembered, it was always cool. I don't remember walking on hot, hot days. And I recall the brooks, and they were beautiful, just rippling along in the woods. And probably it's 2 miles or maybe a little more between the West Washington Road and the Hewitt Road. And I had no trouble walking over that way. It was just an easy walk. And I don't remember ever stopping to rest. We'd just stop and get the flowers and so forth. My mother loved to pick berries, and I hated to pick berries. To me, it was a big, big chore. But she would make all kinds of jam and create new recipes, and it just had so much fun doing that. The West Washington house had a lot of bedrooms, and we I don't know how we ever got started doing this. I guess it was my father and mother's hospitality, but they would welcome everyone on earth, anyone and everyone. And I remember a peddler who always used to stay in Liberty. He was Armenian, and he used to stay in Liberty at the Newell house, Louis Newell's mother and dad's. And then he would peddle his wares. He had a wagon that opened, the sides of which opened out, and he could display all the pots and pans and silverware and kitchen things and clothes, dresses hung up, and all kinds of things. And he would stop at every single house and open up the wagon and usually make a sale, because these were things that people needed. So this was the very last of peddlers. And do you know Shinosky's and Stearns and Levine's? They all started as peddlers, people with packs on their backs first when they initially were in the United States in Maine. And then they would get some kind of conveyance so they wouldn't have to walk, and on and on from there to big, big stores. Old Simon never got to our house. And of course my father would say, "Wouldn't you like to spend the night?" Because he had no place to sleep in his vehicle unless he moved all the housewares out. And I do remember him, and there were many itinerant, well, I don't know if they were itinerant, missionaries who didn't seem to have any home. And they'd stop at country churches and have little prayer meetings and little youth meetings and so forth. And they didn't have any place to stay, and so my mother would say, "Why don't you stay with us?" And I remember one missionary who was later in the Philippines during World War II, and she was in a prison camp for years and years and years. And I was very interested in her after she came back here after the war. And she had had some awful experiences. But I remember that she felt that she was quite a great lady. And my mother would say, you know, that skirt that you have on needs mending. Why don't you let me have it and I'll fix it? And in those days, people darned socks. And you didn't just discard things, not ever. And so Goldie would bring her socks or whatever she needed to have mended to my mother every week. I guess probably every time she noticed that there was a hole in something or a seam that was ripped. And my mother said, well, you know, Goldie, you can do this yourself. And Goldie said, oh no, I'm cut out for higher work. So my mother did it. We had loads and loads of relatives, and we had my father's sister, Naomi, who lived in Rhode Island. She was Ruth's mother, and they were very, very dear to us. And we always would have them down in the summertime. And that's how I started fishing on Long Lake, was the Uncle Charles, Naomi's husband, had a boat over there that he kept in the bushes. And there weren't any cottages on that lake. I don't remember one. So we just welcomed their friends from Rhode Island, everybody who wanted good meals and a place to sleep came and stayed with us. After my mother's death, Pearl McPherson was visiting me. She's the one that I spoke of. I guess maybe we weren't on camera, but I spoke about her and Jim being friends of Herbert and Lou Hoover. And so Pearl told me this unbelievable story, but I know it was true. And she and Annabelle and Tally and my mother were walking up Market Street, and these runaway horses were approaching. And the horses were just absolutely frantic, and they were hauling whatever kind of fire device there was, fire vehicle. And there were no firemen on it. It was just a runaway vehicle behind the horses. And Pearl said that they were headed right for them and right for the sidewalk. And my mother jumped up on the whiffle trees and grabbed the bridles of those horses and stopped them. And nobody could believe it. And finally the firemen caught up with the horses, and they said, why did you do that? Because, you know, she could have so easily been trampled. And she said, they would have run into that plate glass window and they'd have killed themselves. And she loved animals and was always thinking of the other person or the other animal anyway. When I graduated from high school, long before that, my parents had kind of planned on me going to Bates College. And they just did not have any money. Nobody had any money. And Bates College or Colby or any college that was within reasonable distance of us, you could buy a farm with the money that it would have cost to send a child there for a year, and it just couldn't be done. And besides, I had set my sights on nursing because my best friend had gone to what is now May Med in Portland. And she didn't stay, but somehow or other, we had always talked about being nurses. And I thought that it was the thing to do. I never was interested in teaching. And those really were the two options that a girl had in that day, a country girl. And so I went in training to be a nurse, and I loved it. It was great. It was the perfect choice. And I was a good nurse, and I enjoyed it. It was Maine General Hospital, but it's now Maine Med in Portland. And I'm very proud of my career in nursing. And later I became a public health nurse, and I worked in my little rural area in Waldo County and a little bit in Kennebec County. And at one time, the very first year that I was married, I lived in Augusta, and I worked for the city physician, actually for the city of Augusta, and I had great experiences delivering babies. The doctor always came, as a matter of fact, but sometimes it was a little bit late, and it was great experiences. And the people in Augusta, the people who were being supported by the city were just so wonderful. And usually these homes, which were, as a rule, small apartments that I went into, they were just meticulously clean. And once in a while I would get into a place where they didn't have any sheets and that sort of thing. But they had newspapers, they had collected them, they knew that they'd be needed. There were always some older women around, and they helped me, and we just got along fine. And delivering those new babies, it was just such a joy, such a happy thing. One source of recreation was plays. Every organization always needed money, and including the schools. And so people loved to act in plays. And so when I started, probably not until I started high school, I started acting in plays. My mother and father always had. And if this were a popular play, and usually it would be, you'd be invited to go to Liberty, to Vassalboro, to many other communities and put on the play. And you probably charged 25 cents. Maybe it was only 15 cents admission. But you always got a packed house. And so how could you lose? And I remember once we went to Vassalboro in that beautiful Grange Hall that they have. It was in existence and fairly new at that time. And it was so muddy and so stormy that my father wondered if he was going to be able to drive home. And so this teacher who did not board at our house, I think she boarded at Hewitt's, and she was with us, and the Hewitts were with us. There were about 3 carloads of people. But the men, my father and Lloyd Hewitt, had to get home and milk the cows, and in the mornings. And so they were going home, and this school teacher invited me to spend the weekend with her, which I did. And it was the beginning of a lifelong friendship. That was Marcia Heisler. And that's a whole other story, how she helped her three sisters, and how they all graduated from college, and how hard they worked. And it's a wonderful, wonderful story, but I can't go into it right now. Liberty High School, where the man who was to be my husband, where he went to school, they put on a play, and they were invited to come to Washington and reproduce it. And there was always a dance after these gatherings. And the dance was a big deal. And Charlie Overlock and his orchestra always played at the dance. Charlie and Josephine and Burnell. And this time, this particular time, my husband had already graduated from high school, but he and his family, his mother and dad, went to the play in Washington. And during the dance afterward, Ken said that his father kept saying, "Why don't you go ask that girl to dance?" And so finally he did. But I couldn't dance with him because I had promised all the rest of the dances. He's a little bit too late. And then later that summer, I was only 16 years old. And later that summer, I was spending a weekend with the friend who wanted to be a nurse, and with whom we used to talk about nursing, and she went to Maine Med, and we went to a dance. She and her boyfriend and I. She and her boyfriend were older than I, and I did dance with Ken Priest, and finally, after a while, he asked me if I could go home with him. And I said, no, thank you, and that I was going home with Francis and Gilbert. And you know that old song, what is that song? Do you know it? I'm going to dance with the guy that brung me, or something like that. And apparently Ken Priest had talked with Francis and Gilbert about taking me home, and before he talked with me. And so when they got ready to leave, I was going along with them, and they said, "We will not take you home. You're going home with Ken Priest." And that was all right, so I did. It was just a very short distance, probably 4 or 5 miles at the most to this girl's house. And he kissed me. That was my first kiss, my first romantic kiss. And somehow or other, I liked this man. And I used to get letters from another boy in Liberty, and I don't know how I got acquainted with him, probably dancing. And his name was Hazen Hannon, and he used to write me very frequently. And the post office was in a house right beside our house. So, and we had 2 mail deliveries a day, if you can imagine that. So I went for the mail, and here was a letter for me. And nobody ever put return addresses on letters in those days, and at least we didn't. And So I read this whole letter, probably it was about 4 pages, and I thought it was from Hazen because it sounded like him. It wasn't, it was from Ken Priest. I was mighty surprised when I saw that signature. And so he wanted to take me to the movies that next weekend. So I told him that I would come. I wrote to him. You couldn't call people up. The telephone service was just so rotten that you couldn't hear. It would be better to get in a car and go see them. So we used to go to the movies, and that was before Route 3 in Palermo and Liberty was rebuilt. And the road around Lake St. George was a very crooked road. And as I remember it, it was always moonlight, always. And I think it was about every other weekend that they had these black and white, probably soundless. I guess maybe they did talk movies. But anyway, this trip home was wonderful, just absolutely marvelous. We probably went at a very slow pace, and there was the water, the lake on my left, and this beautiful man in the car, and the moon shining on us. It was a wonderful, wonderful time. Eventually, he'd get me home. Then pretty soon, he bought his own car because he was a very ambitious young man, and he had a mentor. His mentor was Donald Matheson, and he was a superintendent of schools, and he just took a very great interest in Ken. And he realized what a mind Ken had, and that he was a math man. And so he taught him calculus and a lot of things that he wasn't getting and that he hadn't gotten in high school. And just like me, it was an impossibility for him to go to college at that time. Nobody went to college. It was an unusual man in this neighborhood in 1934. Well, probably 2 decades before that, it would have been most unusual for the men in this neighborhood, this community where I live now, to go to high school. It was just too difficult. And it was difficult for my husband to go to high school because of the roads. The condition of the roads was absolutely deplorable. This road that I live on was knee-deep in mud in the spring, and you could get a horse over it. And Ken's family would go for groceries. His dad would buy the groceries and make the trip. And he'd go every 2 weeks into Branch Mills. And so how was Ken going to get to school in the winter? Well, that was solved by his mother making all these dishes ahead. And of course, in the winter, you didn't need refrigeration. And nobody had a refrigerator in those days. And very few people, some people had ice boxes. And so she would cook all these goodies. And he would, I don't know how, I guess he must have walked. Or maybe his father found a way on a dry day to get him over to Liberty. And he roomed with the Burkles, and he had his own food with him. And probably they paid a very, very minimal amount to this old couple, Mr. and Mrs. Burkle. And so he was right on top of the schoolhouse practically. And he was so very interested in liberty because the stream that is one outlet, I think, of Lake St. George runs through the village, and there's enough slope, and there is a dam also, and there was at that time, and there were 7 mills on that little stream in Liberty, and my husband was very mechanically minded, so he would visit those mills in the afternoon, every afternoon. Of course, it would get dark very early, but he'd get out of school and just hike right down to the river. And the people knew that the people operating the mills knew that he was interested and understanding, and so they would talk with him and explain exactly what was going on. And after he graduated from high school, he worked for his mentor, and this gentleman had a laundry in Rangeley, and he would go up there and spend every summer and work in the laundry. And he worked there even in the summer, even after I went to Portland and was in nursing school. And I remember the first time that he ever took me to Rangeley. I thought it was heaven on earth. It was paradise up there. And after we were married many years later, a few years later, we were married when I was 22, and we spent our honeymoon in Rangeley at Don Matheson's cottage, and I still just get the biggest thrill out of going to Rangeley. Touristy as it may be now, I still remember all the old hotels and how wonderful it was to get on the delivery truck, the laundry truck, and go, particularly after the season was over and the tourists were gone, and we could just roam the grounds and sit on the porches. The porches, those long porches lined with rocking chairs, always fascinated me, like the Mount Washington Hotel in New Hampshire is now. And I had a friend named Minnie, and I guess she had a husband, but she didn't live with him during the week. She went home weekends probably. And maybe she had left him. And anyhow, Ken and I used to invite her to go to the dances with us. This is probably when I was in high school. And one night we were coming home from a dance in Liberty, and we got to Stickney Corner, the corner of Route 220 and 17, and a truck started right up behind us, and they kept trying to signal us to stop. They wanted us to pull over. Well, it was the middle of the night, and we weren't about to pull over for anybody. And so Ken just drove faster and faster, and they followed us home, and they followed us up the driveway to the brick house. And then we could see what was following us. There was a man with a machine gun in the back of the truck, and the 2 men in the front of the truck in the cab were armed. And they all jumped out and wanted to search our car. Well, we weren't about to let them do anything. And then they said, "We're the Coast Guard, and we just want to make sure that you're all right, that you aren't carrying any liquor." Because there'd been a big shipment of liquor that had come in to Rockland, and it had all disappeared. So they were trying to find out where it went. And the funny part of it was my father and mother's bedroom was right up above that side door by the driveway. And my father opened the window and said, "What in thunder is all the noise out there?" We satisfied the Coast Guardsmen, and away they went.
I can't believe.
In March of 1940, I married my dream man, and we had the most wonderful marriage. I thought that all marriages were like that. And finally, a man who was unhappily married, and I hadn't known it, said, "You know, all marriages are not like yours and Ken's." This was many years after we were married. And he was divorced by his wife later, and I realized how unhappy some people can be. But we had an absolutely wonderful marriage. We belonged together. And we lived in Augusta, and we bought a house, an apartment full of furniture. We had a 2-bedroom, tiny living room and tiny kitchen. It was about 2 years old, and Mr. Dennett had lived there. He had built the apartment for himself, and then for some reason he moved out. And we just loved that apartment. So in 1942, my husband enlisted in the Army Air Force, and it was fall before he got all the physical and mental things out of the way, and he went to Nashville, Tennessee. There was an RAF field there, a very small field where RAF people had been trained, and they had left, and so this was the starting place for the United States Army Air Force people. And my brother insisted upon going with me when I went to Nashville. And I don't remember just how we found a place for me to live. All I needed was a room, and I found a room in a lovely home on Battlefield Drive. And it was near the Air Force base. I can't really remember the name of that base. And it wasn't very long before I told the hostess, the lady who owned the house and who lived there, and she was nice, and we became friends. And I said, I should go to work. I don't have anything to do. So this lovely Southern lady got on the phone, and in her wonderful, gentle voice, she called Vanderbilt University Hospital, and she said, I have a friend here from the north, and she's a registered professional nurse, and I wondered if you might use her, because I know a lot of nurses have gone into the Army. Well, of course they needed me. So out I went, and I was interviewed very, very briefly, and they wanted me to come to work the next day. And nobody ever, during those war years, there was such a shortage of nurses, nobody ever wanted to look at my main registration nor my papers. It wouldn't be that way today. And so I worked there, and I learned a lot. It's a big teaching hospital, and it was a wonderful experience. And I won't go into all the places that I worked, but every time my husband was moved to another training center, I moved right along and got a job. And I worked everywhere from a big hospital to an old mansion that had been converted into a hospital in Americus, Georgia. And that was quite an experience. And I had some quite adventures there. You really had to do things that were a little bit unorthodox, and you kind of stretched the boundaries a little bit because they needed a lot of things. And finally, my husband graduated. He got his wings, and I have pictures of me pinning his wings on. And that was in Illinois. And there was a big, big thing, like almost like a prom. And everybody, it was a big dance after graduation. And so another girl and I went to Chicago, and we spent a week up there. And we just had the nicest time, but we nearly froze. It was June, but it was so cold in Chicago. And we bought clothes and bought clothes at the very nicest stores. I remember Fields, and I don't really recall all the others, but we took home some nice things. And then after that period, my husband was transferred to Wendover, Utah, and that's an awful place. It's right on the border of Utah and Nevada, and it's more than 100 miles from Salt Lake City, which is the closest place that I could possibly live. And I loved Salt Lake City. And I found out that I was pregnant, and which had been long desired. And I was kind of sick, but that was all right. So I didn't work in Salt Lake City. I decided my nursing career was over for a while. And we rented a darling little house, but I had to live in it alone because my husband was just so busy out there flying among those mountains and over the salt flats that he didn't get home very often. And I used to go out and visit him, but there wasn't any place for me to stay all night, so I'd have to drive out in the morning and sit in the officers' club, and probably I played bridge all day. And it was an awful, awful time in my life. I didn't feel too well anyway, and there was just nothing for me to do. I was used to being extremely active, and people were being killed like everything in the airplanes. They had a bunch of old airplanes that they were training in. This was close to a departure for Europe. And I'm sure that the planes were the best that the United States could get. And here were these mountains. There was Pilot's Peak right almost looming over the airfield. If you ever go to Wendover, take a look at those mountains. You had to be an expert pilot to even get out of that field. And so almost every day a chaplain would come into the O Club, and we never knew who he was headed for. It could be you, it could be me, and thank God it never was me. But it was just an awful, awful time. So many people were being killed. But I guess it was necessary. Ken was going to depart from Hutchinson, Kansas. So another girl and I drove across the Rockies and just had a wonderful trip. In fact, we spent an extra day because it was just so beautiful, and I knew how little time our husbands would have to spend with us. The other girl's husband was really concerned because we didn't arrive when we should. But my husband knew me, and he knows what a procrastinator I am, and so he calmed the other guy's fears. And I'm still in touch with that girl. Her husband has died. He was Ernie Benchamal, and he owned the Benchamal School in Cambridge, and very famous prep school. And so my husband went by way of Trinidad and Belial and Marrakech, you know, the real roundabout southern route to get to England. And then he was stationed near Norfolk in England. And years after his death, I was with my cousin, and we had a car. And we decided that we would try and find these fields where he flew. And we knew that one of them was North Pickenham. And so every day I would go into the pubs. We would go into the pubs. And it was just so nice. I love the pubs in England anyway. And I would seat myself beside the oldest people there. And usually there'd be a man all by himself at a table, and I'd be able to sit there and talk with him. But most of them were too young. They even 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, they didn't really remember exactly where the bases were. But finally, I hit pay dirt. We were up near North Pickenham, and at that time I didn't really know how to say the word, and so being a New Englander, I said North Pickenham. And he said, "You'll never find it if you don't call it by the right name, North Pickenham." And finally, we were driving along, and we found the field after we had driven through miles and miles and miles of Brussels sprouts and cabbages, where all the airfields, both the RAF and the United States Airmen had been stationed. And finally, on the right, I spied these Quonset huts, and there was just a little tiny break in the hedgerows, and I could see them. So we backed up and went in, and that was the field. That was the place. And the runway, part of the runway was still there, and it was what the man had directed me to. It was just about the only one that was left there, because it's marvelous, marvelous agricultural land, and why shouldn't they raise good veggies there? There was something else I was going to mention about that. The use that it was put to at that time. Farmers were storing their equipment in there. The Quonset huts were all full of tractors and all kinds of trucks and things.
There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover tomorrow. and peace ever after. Tomorrow, when the world is free, the shepherd will tend his sheep, the valley will bloom again, and Jimmy will go to sleep in his own little room again.
I didn't mind army life. If I had had a house, a better place to live, I think that I could have been an army wife. But Ken hated it. He just did not like it. He didn't mind fighting the war, and I'm sure he minded because he was in heavy bombers. He had chosen heavy bombers over fighter planes. And I think the idea of 4 engines appealed to him. And but at the time he was a bomber pilot, about 2 out of 5 bomber pilots were surviving. Maybe that was all of the pilots. Maybe that included the fighters as well as the bomber pilots. And that was a really, really lethal time for the American Air Force. And even worse for the RAF. It had been worse, much worse, before we stepped in. And in fact, they probably would have lost the war if America hadn't come to the rescue. Where did I leave off?
Did he bomb with the RAF? Were they on the same bases and interacted, or they were separate?
The bases were completely separate, and the commands were entirely separate.
Did he bomb over Germany? I mean, he bombed
Yes.
all over.
Yes, that was why he was there.
Mhm.
And of course, you don't want to kill people.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you want to preserve your own country. And after the attack at Pearl Harbor in 1941, you know, everybody was fired up, and they did not want another invasion of our country. And everyone was beginning to know about Hitler and how horrible he was. And so I think that they kind of just thought of it as a job to do. And they were so busy. You were just so busy trying to escape flak and get yourself to your target and have the bombardier drop those bombs. There was a crew of 10 or 11 on this B-24. And Ken had a wonderful pilot, a wonderful navigator. You had to navigate, going from South America to Africa, you had to navigate by the stars. They did not have technology, was pitiful compared to what we know now. And you just didn't have the instruments. And I remember him speaking about Ascension Island, that is a little bit closer to Africa, I think. I should look at the map. I think it's a little closer to Africa than it is to South America. But you have to stop there, and if you don't hit it, you're not going to be able to gas up, and you won't ever get anywhere. And you're just going to fall into the ocean and die. And Purcell, his navigator, hit it. It was just great. And he just felt so wonderful about his crew. He loved them.
So
And they loved him. And they used to write to him afterward.
It was a real.
Ken and I had decided that instead of coming back to Augusta and living all by myself, being the one single woman, one woman who didn't have a husband around, in our group, it just wouldn't be good. And so he suggested that I go to San Francisco and visit my relatives there. And the reason people in Augusta weren't in the Army and so forth, in fact, there really wasn't any of our particular social group who weren't right there, still living with their wives. And the reason for that is that they were working at Bath building ships. And the women were working at Bath building ships too. So after Hutchinson, Kansas, I drove to San Francisco. I had a Plymouth car that Ken had given me on my birthday after the year we were married. And I just drove it everywhere, all over the country. And somehow or other, I managed to get gasoline. I don't know just how. I didn't, it wasn't as readily available. I really had to use ration books after I was out of the protection of the United States Army. And so when I lived in San Francisco, I really didn't have an opportunity to go to the places that I was interested in. I had to visit them much later in life, like Yosemite and all the great sites, Northern California, way up north. I didn't work while I was in San Francisco. I never did work again for years and years and years because I was raising my family. I had a good pregnancy, I had a good doctor, and my child was, he was born at St. Mary's Hospital in San Francisco, and it was really funny. It wasn't funny. I was very glad that I had seen him in the delivery room because I had a high temperature after I returned to my room, and I was sick. I had some kind of an infection. Well, finally, we decided it was an abscessed tooth. And so my dentist came in, and the tooth was extracted, and I was okay. And I had an awful time. Maybe the men who watch this video wouldn't be very interested, but women would. I was going to nurse that baby, and nursing babies was not done right at that particular time. And so I had a terrible time with those nuns, getting them to obtain a breast pump for me, and an electric breast pump, and letting me extract milk so that I would be able to breastfeed my baby when I ever got him again. And finally I was well enough, and I could have my baby. And another funny thing that happened, during my pregnancy, I had decided to call on this old archbishop that I knew. And so I went to his gloomy, big old house, and we just had a wonderful time. We had such good conversations. So he came to see me when I had the baby and I was in the hospital. And he was a riot. He loved to stir people up. So when he entered the hospital, he went to the front desk and he said, I'd like to see the priest who had a baby. And nobody quite knew what he was talking about. And he didn't tell them that there was a real Mildred priest up there who had given birth. And he came out to my house probably when my child Ken was, maybe 3 months old. And we were picking peaches in the backyard. And I had an apartment in my uncle's house. And he raised show rabbits. And so it really was an interesting backyard. He had several fruit trees. And the doorbell rang one Sunday, and my uncle answered the door. It was a long way from the backyard to the front of that house. And here was the Archbishop. And so Uncle Aubrey brought him down to the garden, and he helped us pick peaches, and we just had the best time. And I have pictures of him holding Ken. And we gave him a bag of peaches to take home. And the neighbors, we lived in an Italian neighborhood, and we knew everybody. And so after his vehicle had left, he had a chauffeur, and everybody came to the door, and they wanted to know what was going on. And that was the longest car that they had ever seen. And who was that? So my uncle told them all about it. How easy it was to walk around in San Francisco in the 40s. A group of women, and I used to just go anywhere that we felt like. We'd go to North Beach and walk from North Beach down through Chinatown, and then walk back up Market Street, and no one ever accosted us, and we felt perfectly safe. And I think you were safe in Chinatown anyway. And it was a good place. I loved San Francisco, Chinatown. It's a party town. It was a big party town then. And a lot of my father and mother's friends were still living, and they were just so delighted to see Arno and Lina's daughter. And so there were parties down on Market Street at the Women's Club, where everybody had a mink coat, which they didn't need really in San Francisco at that time of year. But it was fun to get into those places. And I still had some friends. I had some friends who lived in Merced, and I can't remember where Barb Brown lived. But she didn't live very far away. She was across the bay from me, but we used to do things together and spend weekends together. And Ines and Marie, Marie became my sister-in-law in later years. And Ines is a dear, dear friend, one of my very best friends. And so they jumped on a bus one day and came out and lived with me. I kept house for them. I had nothing else to do other than generate this baby. And we had a good, good time. The Mark Hopkins Hotel in San Francisco was the place in which to entertain out-of-town visitors and first-time to San Francisco visitors. So we very frequently would go to the top of the Mark, and the view from there is fantastic. I just love walking around up there and looking at the city. And I know there are higher hotels now. In fact, I think the Fairmont must be higher. Isn't it taller?
I'm not sure.
And that was before the days of the glass elevators. But we enjoyed those things very much. And I loved shopping in San Francisco because I was a country girl. I had had to buy things out of Sears Roebuck's catalog. And I'd lived in Augusta, which was really a pretty good shopping area early in my marriage. It isn't anymore.